Okay, why don't we get started? I'm going to introduce Jim in a minute, but I want to draw everyone's attention to an old friend, our former provost, our dear colleague, Dick Sisson, who's back with us for about 5 weeks, 6 weeks, Dick?
Offer me an office and I'll travel.
So, and actually, Dick is actually older than me. There is someone. And he was a Mershon Fellow here when he was an undergraduate, or a graduate student. First research assistant at the Mershon Center when it was first established. And then went on to great things, both at UCLA and here at Ohio State. So it's great to have you back, Dick. Okay, the main event today is to introduce Jim Morrow and then have him speak. Jim is the AFK Organsky Professor of World Politics at the University of Michigan. He's written widely on international conflict and the intersection of international and domestic politics, the theory of a selectorate and essentially rational decisions to go to war is something he has been a pioneer in producing. The Order Within Anarchy, The Logic of Political Survival is a classic that's taught by most professors around the country. He's well known for his work on game theory. He's written several other books, most recently one on international law. He won the Karl Deutsch Award for early career success from the International Studies Association, and he's currently a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's great to have Jim here as a potential director of the Mershon Center. Jim, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Rick. Okay, so is my voice showing up on the microphone first? Can you tell? Not for my computer. Oh, okay. All right, that's fine. So we'll go. I want to introduce the talk a little bit today. So I wanted to do a talk that would cross sort of the two main fields that are here in Mershon, which is obviously political science, where I come from, and also history. I hope also it will be, for those of you who are outside those two fields, will find the talk interesting as well. So it's going to be a talk a little bit of both. It's going to have some political science first, and then I'm going to talk about some historical research on the pattern. Whoa, got to watch which buttons I'm pushing here. On historical work on the experiences of the treatment of prisoners of war during the two world wars. Okay, so where I want to start is a quote, the quote that I actually start the chapter in my book about, which is from before World War I. And it's a comment about why are we treating prisoners of war so nicely? If they do this, no one will want to fight whatsoever. I won't sit here and actually read the quote to you. You can read it. But one reason why I like this quote is that this is something that now us, 100 years later, find shocking in many ways. And so one thing that is part of the story here that I'm actually not going to talk about are long-term changes in attitudes towards how we should think about prisoners of war. Instead, what I am going to talk a little bit about is how did law eventually create a system that improved treatment of prisoners of war over time, and why are there still important stumbling blocks, at least within this historical record around that? And so to do that, I want to talk a little bit about international humanitarian law. This talk is drawn on my book that came out about 2.5 years ago, Order Within Anarchy. And this is an attempt to make a broad general argument about international law and how it operates in practice, applied specifically to the law of war, or more properly, international humanitarian law. And here the sort of the observation that I want to start with is to think about the growth of this law. If you go back millennia in time, those who fought, those sort of societies of different political units that fought often, commonly, but not always, developed conventions about what was acceptable conduct during time and what was unacceptable. So ideas that violence during wartime should be limited in one form or another go back, sort of almost as long as people have fought wars. But one thing that's kind of distinctive of the last century and a half, beginning in the 1860s, is the growth of a large amount of formal international law that seeks to regulate conduct during wartime. And so in that sense, it's a distinctive feature and worth talking about. And so out of that, sort of, now I'm not going to have all the big dates here in the growth of international humanitarian law, but sort of starting relevant to this talk, First, we would go with the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 that attempt to lay out broad ideas about appropriate conduct during wartime and inappropriate conduct during wartime in a large number of issues. Obviously, for POWs, if I was going to speak just about that, I might go back to the Lieber Code during the American Civil War. Then after World War I, in light of the successes and the failures of this law during World War I, international humanitarian law was revisited in the interwar period. Most notably in the 1925 Geneva Protocol that banned the use of chemical and biological weapons, but more notably for this talk, the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. Now, again, this law had a mixed record of success during World War II, which then led to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which were then expanded by the additional protocols in the 1970s. And so what this picture is, there's not a lot of eye candy in this talk, but there's a little bit. This is actually the signing of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. And so there's a bunch of different state representatives. This fellow here, I don't know what country he's from, but he's obviously wearing a uniform like they're signing. Now, in one sense, there is sort of a return, as I mentioned, with the additional protocols and a growth of some more of that law in the 1970s, but the next big period where there's more action in the growth of legal development in this area is after the Cold War, where you had the Chemical Weapons Convention and then the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court and attempts to create actually a formal international body to try those who violate laws of war and crimes against humanity. And also the point about the growth of this is almost all members of the United Nations have ratified the Geneva Conventions. Now, I'll admit, I cheated. I did not look up whether or not South Sudan has ratified yet. I know they're in the process of ratifying, but that gives you a sense of everybody who's in the UN has accepted this. Okay. Now, having said that, well, now I get to the political science part, which is to talk about, well, okay, so we have all these treaties. How might they make a difference? And how might they shape behavior in different ways? And to start with, we begin with one of the oldest sort of lines in the study of international politics, which is there is no superior authority that actually enforces the law. So that unlike domestic law, there isn't some sort of third-party, sort of separate government authority that we can go to enforce it. But this doesn't mean that the law can't be enforced or does not change behavior. It could, first and foremost, it could be, or whether or not states actually follow through depends on their own incentives to do that. And there are a variety of different incentives. That's one of the things, sort of important parts about this talk that I'll amplify more when we get to talking about prisoners of war, is there often are very diverse attitudes or views towards whether and how violence should be limited during wartime across states at war. So the first of these is that compliance with these treaties could result simply from self-restraint. And so the countries simply follow the law because they want to follow it. Now, there are different ways in which self-restraint could come. Some would be because they have a desire to comply. And I'll give you some examples of motivations that look like that. They see it simply as in their interest to do that. Second is this law isn't like dropped out of the skies. It's created through negotiations. And presumably the states that participate in those negotiations have an interest in creating law to realize things they couldn't in the absence of that law. And in that sense, they may be interested in following it because it's something that they're interested in trying to accomplish in one form or another. So, for example, in the law of war case, that may be around things that once you start mobilizing mass armies where you're going to conscript large numbers of your citizens, part of the bargain that makes that work, that makes citizens more willing to submit to conscription, is the idea that you might attempt to limit violence to some extent during wartime, but that can be part of the implicit bargain in there. A third reason why parties might engage in self-restraint are audience costs of different types. That is, parties outside the government itself that can impinge on what the government does in the future in different ways, that in the anticipation of that future cost leads it to do things that it wouldn't want to do otherwise. Those audiences could be international in the sense of other states, or they could be domestic in the sense of groups inside society. And I'll try and give you an example, particularly in World War II, where there's sort of a prominent example of the public interacting with POW policy. Finally, a last reason why you might have self-restraint on its own is that democracies by their nature are, and the term I take from the law literature, is law-bound states, in the sense that by their nature, their form of government is constituted by law. And as such, it's possible then to take international commitments and sink them into domestic law in different forms. And thereby, international law can become enforced through domestic law and institutions, and thereby that even if the leaders of the state don't want to do it, that it may be that they're sort of brought into compliance through those mechanisms. Now, having said that, not everyone, as you'll hear later in this talk, is restrained. And so what are some of the reasons why parties might actually engage in violations? Well, one obviously is self-interest, and I'm going to give you some good examples of that in a bit, where parties have seen violations as actually in their interest. A second reason is lack of capacity. That is, that they'd like to do the right thing, but they simply, for a variety of different reasons, don't have the ability to follow through on that. And finally, the third of these that will also crop up in this talk is that it may be that the law is not sufficiently specific, that parties disagree about whether or not particular acts are actually violations or not. And that the lack of clarity then can create a situation where, for example, one party does something that it considers as acceptable under the law, but the other side doesn't. And then the other side retaliates in kind in one form or another, and you get a spiral downwards out of compliance. And I'll give you a nice example of that. Okay, now the other possibility that you could do this is that other states could respond to violations of the law. And so this is beyond just like an audience cost of a party that's not involved in the war. But another thing that law does is by creating, or at least attempting to create standards and attempting to make them common knowledge, that law then and violations of it can serve as a trigger for when third parties should respond and when they should not. And in that sense then, law can be helpful because it helps parties understand, well, you did something that was bad but allowable under the law, or you did something that was bad and not allowable under the law, and the predictability of understanding when others will see that as a violation or not could be useful. And so part of what law does through a common text is that it creates common expectations about appropriate conduct and what responses are likely to follow from inappropriate conduct. Now across this is one of the big points of the book, which I'm obviously not going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a single issue here, which is prisoners of war. But it's also understand across international law generally that different issues pose different sorts of problems. And this is why different parts of international law look different from one another. Because if law isn't created in part to try and address these issues and those problems, and in some sense is designed or over time modified to help them address those issues, then law in different areas should look different. So trade, with its heavy emphasis on multilateral standards with bilateral enforcement, looks very, very different from human rights, where there's almost no form of enforcement whatsoever, but instead creates universal standards, versus international humanitarian law, which may not explicitly say what sorts of retaliation is appropriate, but in different ways, as we'll see, implies different aspects of it. And so one thing that this approach to international law does is also explain why these different bodies of international law look fundamentally different out of it. Okay, so here's the argument in the broadest sense about what are the problems underlying, that go on in the control of violence that underlie international humanitarian law. And so if I think about two states at war, colorfully named State A and State B, are at war with one another, and there are three interrelated strategic problems. The first one is the one that most people think of, which is the relationship between State A and State B, of do they think that the other one is actually trying to comply or not? And that's one of the problems that's there. There's also, however, another problem at the other level, which is that for international humanitarian law to make a difference, it has to change some behavior, at least on the battlefield. Now, it also has to change some behavior behind the battlefield for certain things. But in a number of the issues that are out there, the action, and that will prove to be the case in POWs, is often what happens on the battlefield. And this, I'll talk a little bit more about what this looks like in a second, but that's the second problem, which is how is it you get, when soldiers are on the battlefield with a sort of the internal logic of kill or be killed, how do they understand how the other side might react to that? And therefore, then think about that. And then out of that, there's the connection between these two levels, which is the process inside states by which states control their soldiers as agents. And that, in this case, broadly in this area, is predominantly an issue around military training and discipline. But that too then looks like a principal agent problem where even if a state wants to do the right thing and try and follow the law, if its soldiers don't do that, then it's effectively out of compliance, separate from what state policy is. Okay, that's the big broad one. I apply that to 8 different areas of 8 different issues in international humanitarian law and talk about that. And if people want, I can talk more at length about some of those things, but I'm going to pass on that. And so now I want to talk about why do those 3 problems matter? And this is why you want legal institutions in the form of creation of treaty to deal with it. Because if I think about this problem here, how each party wants to solve one of these depends on what's happening in those other problems. So for example, if I'm an individual soldier on the battlefield and I'm trying to decide, hey, if I go out there and they're trying to surrender, are they actually going to surrender, or is this a ruse to take advantage of me? Now, part of that is determined by what's going on here in my green arrow game, but part of that's also determined on up here because it might be that State B is telling all its soldiers, no, we don't want you to take prisoners, or we want to break that down, and I'll give you some examples that look like that later. And so here, as sort of a political science institutional problem, is the solution to all these depend on what's going on in the other areas. And so in that sense, whether or not states see an advantage in violating the rules also depends on whether or not they're willing to invest in the systems that allow them to bring their soldiers to engage in behaviors that are more likely to be in compliance. And then finally on the battlefield, where the strategic expectations really matter, where people are really in a position where literally it is life or death. And how you think the other side is going to respond is absolutely critical out of that there can be, sorry, got to use some game theory language here, multiple equilibria. That is, we can have a situation where the anticipations are that there will be lots of violations, and as a result there are a lot of violations. That is, that parties do take actions to protect themselves. We can also have one where the expectations are that violations will be relatively rare will be self-reinforcing. And that part of what the law is trying to do then is to create a solution across all 3 of these because how each of them is dealt with is interdependent. Okay, so out of that, why might treaties matter? One way they matter substantially here is they operate as a screening mechanism. And this is one of the important observations of the book in general, which is that, so a treaty has this interesting property that sets up a common single text that parties formally accept through the process of ratification, although exactly how they ratify varies from state to state. And that states under law are, now I realize there's a lot of arguments right here about customary law, but in the strictest reading are not actually bound until they ratify. Now the key thing about this is ratification is not what is informative. Non-ratification is. That's why we call it a screen. Some of the parties that pass through the screen and ratify actually probably aren't interested in following through and don't. But the ones who don't ratify, the ones who say, we don't like those rules, we're not going to live by them, are sending a clear message of that intent. And in that sense, ratification operates as a screening mechanism. Well, why might parties want to do that? Well, some parties might want to do that because in their strategic calculation, they actually believe they benefit from a less restrained battlefield. And they think that's an advantage. So in that sense, what they're trying to do is influence this one to create a battlefield which has higher levels of violations. And so finally, what treaties are doing here in this sense is they're an attempt to create common knowledge. Not only what should the rules be, but do I have a good idea whether or not I think you're likely to follow through on these, or whether or not I should suspect whether or not you will. Okay. Now, also the key point about this, because there are 3 interlocked problems, the laws of war typically, but not exclusively, focus on state obligations, but they also create individual rights and obligations. That's part of why training is important. Yes, we'll see a nice example of that. The training is important because soldiers have to learn both what their rights and their responsibilities are under international humanitarian law. And there's a really nice story about an unexpected consequence of the absence of training here. And so what this also means, though, that in practice, when we think about reciprocity in law, we often think about it at the state level. So like in trade, that's what happens, reciprocal trade sanctions. But in this area, reciprocity also happens on the battlefield. That when one side engages in behavior that causes a corrosion of behavior on the battlefield, that can erode to the point where effectively you get retaliation, but it's not necessarily deliberate state policy as much as it is in the conduct of individual soldiers. Because on many of these issues, but not all, and most notably on prisoners of war, much of the real action is what happens on the battlefield. Okay, so I'm not going to jump into World War I yet. So now let me talk specifically about prisoners of war and some of the issues that it poses within the range of these 8 issues that the book talks about in the law of war. And here it's important to understand that sort of over the centuries, treatment of POWs has changed substantially and varied both across time and across space. And if you want the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk some more about the broader sweep of history about what things looked like 200 years ago, how it has some historical legacies that go on into the World War period, and that only disappear with 1949 Geneva and the like. But it's key to understand that there have been many different attitudes about how should you respond to both enemy soldiers who are signaling an intent to surrender to you, what you do with them afterwards, and what should you do with respect to your own soldiers who might be considering surrender. And those have varied a lot. Now, POWs pose a number of specific strategic problems in their own. First of all, is there substantial variation in state attitudes towards prisoners of war and how they should be treated. That's sort of the reflection of that opening quote we had from Spaeth, and he was English. And so here there are questions like, does a state actually want to encourage surrender or discourage it? And that can go in both directions because, as we'll see, some parties want to discourage their own soldiers from surrendering, and others at different times want to encourage the soldiers of the other side to surrender. And they just simply vary in how they think about that. Secondly, POWs also pose a wide variation in how they should be treated in terms of their use as a source of labor or possible recruits into their own army. And again, that's going to be a big part of the story here about differences of what do we do with these people once they get back behind the lines into the collection point. Because one of those things about POWs is the most dangerous time if you want to try and surrender and become POW is the point between which you signal your intent to surrender until you get to the collection point. Not just be taken to surrender at the front, but you get to the collection point behind enemy lines. And out of that then when you get there, however, you're a potential source of labor. And I'll talk about how that worked out in both the different world wars. All right. Beyond this, another thing that makes this issue hard is in that principal agent control problem, individual soldiers actually have a lot of leeway. You know, from the sort of apocryphal accounts or eyewitness accounts of these, it's not unusual that individual soldiers, you know, they have a lethal weapon, and that they use it to kill enemy soldiers who have either surrendered or attempted to surrender. And so as a result is, unlike some of the other issues in this area, there's not a great deal of direct control over what soldiers do. And that's going to make that problem harder because you can try and change that by training and discipline in different ways, including military justice, but they have a lot of leeway to do things on their own. This is important because if you have a state that wants to encourage the enemy to surrender, you've got to figure out how to make sure that your soldiers will follow through and take the actions so that over time, soldiers learn things from rumors and other things about what goes on, so that when the enemy thinks about surrendering, they have confidence that there's a reasonable chance they may actually survive that encounter. Finally, a last issue that's relevant here is the lack of knowledge of what goes on in POW camps behind enemy lines. Because after all, they're back there. And I think I have somewhere here, I'll talk a little bit about the ICRC and its role as a monitor and how that works. Okay, so now let me start to talk about World War I, because I'm going to draw a basic contrast in big, broad patterns between conduct during World War I and conduct during World War II. And they make a really nice contrast because they show the two big differences in making the law actually work and why it fails in different times and others. And in World War I, the broad general pattern is that most countries wanted to try to follow the rules, and they generally tried to do this. However, there are a host of different problems that made this harder. One big set of issues here go around camp conditions, because the two Hague Conventions, they give broad general outlines of it, but they don't provide great specificity about how you're supposed to handle troops when you get them back into POW camps and what you're allowed to do with them. So those include issues like discipline. So this picture at the top, I believe this is an Austro-Hungarian prison camp in World War I. And if you can't see, they're disciplining these POWs by basically tying them up against the wall with their arms behind them. And that in some militaries, this was acceptable military justice and military punishment, and it was carried out on POWs around that. That's an example of sort of the disagreement on how things we've done. Now here, actually I'll come back to this one in a second. So two big issues are big that affect the survival of POWs while in captivity around camp conditions. The first of these is food. And that's because, in World War I history, the British blockade substantially reduces the supply of food in Germany in combination with the blockade and the drawing out of large amounts of men working on farms reduces agricultural production substantially. And so Germany goes through, I believe my recollection is the turnip winter, in 1917, 1918, where essentially, basically the level of food that civilians get goes down to starvation levels. Now the Germans at that point are concentrating what food supplies they have and sending them to the front line to the soldiers. And their attitude is, why should we feed these POWs any better than we feed our own civilians? And as a result, there's very, very serious food deficits among POWs. This creates big differences across different countries whose soldiers are held prisoner in Germany and Austria-Hungary based on whether or not the home country provides parcels, which is what the bottom picture is here. This is a group of British POWs receiving parcels sent from the homeland that provide food and the like that supplement it. And as a result, from those countries that provided parcels sent from the homeland to POWs held in Germany, they had much lower death rates because they had better diets. So the British survived better than the French did. But the country that did the worst that the Germans held substantial numbers of were Italians. And that's because the Italians basically did nothing for the men who were held, in part because they thought they never should have surrendered in the first place. Okay. Another really big issue that creates problems inside the camps is endemic disease. Because once you start to concentrate a lot of men there who actually have been out in the field for a long time, and if you don't have appropriate sanitation and the like, typhus, for example, is quite common. This was a large issue between Austria-Hungary and Russia, because both of them had more primitive camps in which endemic disease became a problem. And so here were issues around camp conditions where the lack of specificity on these contributed to POW deaths in camps. A second really large issue in World War I that creates problems between the parties are work conditions, because it's accepted that you can put enlisted men but not officers to work at that time. And then the question becomes, what are they allowed to do? Well, the Hague Conventions say they're not allowed to be engaged, I can't remember the exact term, it's either war material or active war activities. But then there's disagreement about what that constitutes. And what happens between the French and the British on one side and the Germans over time is you get one of these spirals where, because they can't agree on exactly what that means, parties engage in acts which they don't think are violations, which the other side interprets them. So you get a spiral where, at first, the Germans object to the French sending a substantial number of Germans taken prisoner to North Africa to work on construction work there, because they believe that assists the war effort in France. And as a result, the Germans begin to use French and then later British POWs building things like rail lines up towards the front. This then creates, as the British and the French don't approve of this, they begin using German POWs closer to the front. And by the time you get to the end of the war, both sides are using enemy POWs on labor that's not constructing fortifications, but effectively is supporting the direct military effort at the front line within range of their own artillery. So they're really right at, very, very close to the front line, but not on it. And this spiral comes about again because they don't have a clear agreement on what work is allowable and what isn't. And as a result, the lack of clarity leads to a breakdown. The last sort of big issue here is the question about, are you allowed to actually recruit POWs into military units of your own? And on the Eastern Front, most of the parties try and do this. So the most famous of these is the Czech Legion, which is recruited out of Czech POWs into the Russian army. Now, of course, it's famous. What makes it famous is that it gets trapped inside Russia after the Russian Revolution, when the Russian Civil War comes about. And in 1918, they fight their way across the Trans-Siberian Railway until they can be taken out with the hope of shipping them to France, where they can continue the war on the Western Front. But the Austrians also tried to do this with Russian prisoners, and the Germans also tried to recruit Poles and the like. Now, those were not typically terribly successful, but there's also questions about to what extent is that acceptable or not. Okay, whoa, not going to go ahead to World War II yet. All right, so the key thing out of this is that here's one where clarity in the law matters. Because we have a situation where the parties generally want to try and follow the rules, but because the rules aren't clear enough, it leads to erosion of conduct over the course of the war. The other big frontier that matters, in which World War I is somewhat different from World War II, is what happens on the battlefield. Now, this is primarily apocryphal evidence. It's drawn from a variety of different, sort of different stories, and those who tried to summarize the military experience in different fronts of World War I. But it's quite common in World War I to find stories where there are charges of perfidy. That is, where one side, for example, uses a signal to surrender as a way to bring the other side out into the open where they can be fired on. That is, using the protections of international humanitarian law to gain an unfair advantage on the battlefield. And alternatively, enough examples where, for local level, officers order no quarter. That is, no prisoners will be taken. And that this is more common in the World War I case than the World War II case. And as a result, you get some erosion of conduct actually on the battlefield itself. And as a practical matter in World War I, most of the soldiers who are taken prisoner are commonly taken prisoner in large collections of prisoners. At least tens, in some cases up to hundreds of thousands. That also generally tends to be true in most of these experiences. So as a result of the consequence of the experience in which the lack of clarity of law led to an erosion of conduct over time, one of the primary things that the 1929 Geneva Convention seeks to do is to clarify key parts of that law. So it attempts to clarify what POW labor can be applied to avoid the kind of spiral downward they had on the Western Front, how much they're allowed to be paid, also the fact that officers cannot be required to work but may volunteer to do so if they wish. In food, they shift to a standard that says you have to feed POWs as well as you feed your own soldiers. That will have an interesting knock-on consequence in World War II, because it will get revisited in 1949. And then finally, the other thing they try and clarify is to what extent inside a camp are the camp authorities allowed to discipline POWs who are there? What are they allowed to do and under what conditions? To limit that, to avoid things like the shackling we had there on the top picture, but also then questions about how can POWs actually complain? And this is also what I'll mention just sort of quickly. This is the start of the ICRC as a monitoring body. That it sort of spontaneously adopts this. If you go to Geneva and go to the ICRC, International Red Cross, they have a museum there. You can see like the original files from World War I where there's a card for every POW. And what they did was collect the names of POWs, inform the home country who was actually taken prisoner, which is valuable because then they know who's alive and who may not be, but also then begin the process of monitoring camps. But at this point, the ICRC does not have the role it had most prominently actually after World War II and to some extent World War II, because they still rely on neutral powers, called the protecting powers, to do the monitoring. Okay, World War II is a different story. World War II is a story, and I'm going to tell us across three different fronts of World War II. And this is a story where you have some parties that want to follow it and some parties that don't. And the knock-on consequences of those two, both the logic that underlies both those, and also the complexities of trying to make things work even when the parties want to agree on it. So first we start with and this is a relatively happy story, is World War II. World War II on the Western Front, between Germany and the Western Allies. And so here, one way to summarize POW conduct quickly, I didn't throw up a lot of these tables. If you go and look in the book, I tried to collect out a lot of sources, sort of death rates of POWs. Because they're a really nice, simple, handy way to get a ballpark idea of what's relatively good treatment and what's really bad treatment. So out of this, of the Allied prisoners who fell into German hands, these are British, Commonwealth, and U.S. servicemen, about 4% die in German hands. Of those who are held by the Western Allies, less than 1% die. Now out of this, there are different things that happen. First, and of course here we have, this is a picture of a nice, neat POW camp, example of what it looks like in World War II compared to World War I, in a case where the parties actually are interested in following. Now at the state-to-state level, this is broadly a case where both sides more or less want to follow the rules. And out of this, there's some interesting aspects of this I want to highlight. The first is, as I mentioned, audience costs. In Britain, there's substantial pressure from basically the families of POWs, because remember, a substantial number of British soldiers are taken prisoner in 1940. So they're there for a long period of time. And they pressure Parliament, particularly Commons in different ways, to lobby for either the return of more POWs, particularly those who are incapacitated, or alternatively better treatment, such as also advanced prisoner exchanges and the like. And they consistently bring pressure on the British government throughout this period. This creates a very interesting divergence between the United States and Britain when you get to late 1944 and 1945, because the British now who've had soldiers held prisoner for 4 years or more at that point, their health is deteriorating. The British would like to get them back through an exchange. The U.S. doesn't want to do exchanges because although it has prisoners there, they don't want to turn anyone over to Germany who might be put back into the fight, even if they go to the Eastern Front. And so there's a tension then between Britain and the United States over this, which comes about because Britain has more domestic pressure, basically for the welfare of POWs, and the United States is less concerned about the issue because its men held prisoner have been held for a much shorter period. There's also questions about, now, Germany is not a country, Nazi Germany is not a country anyone would refer to as a law-bound state. And sort of the interesting aspect about this is that their conduct with respect to the Western Allies is generally pretty good. But there are some notable exceptions here. So, like, the famous one is The Great Escape. So I assume you've seen the movie. But the story here is, so the Germans basically culled out all the sort of the serial escape artists among the British and American prisoners, and they concentrated them in one particular camp, which is designed to be hard to break out. And what the movie is about is how they actually wanted to do a mass breakout in the months before D-Day. And so The Great Escape is a large number, I think it's like close to 80 POWs escaped from the camp, and they spread all over Europe. Very, very few of them actually get to true freedom and necessity into a neutral country. So when this comes about, they have a meeting. At least so it's reported in the book about this, in which Hitler basically says, okay, shoot them all. And Goering points out, there's this problem by Fuhrer. If we shoot them all, they'll figure out it can't be an accident. You know, if you shoot them all, they'll know that these were executions. And he goes, okay, in that case, shoot 50. And of course, this doesn't work because there's actually a Swiss official who's involved in monitoring this camp. And the British figure out that, let's see, 80 guys got out, only 30 came back. And you say the other 50 were shot trying to escape. I don't think so. So they basically come to the conclusion that they figure out what's happened. And of course, the Swiss, who's involved in this, eventually communicates this to the British. And so the ruse of trying to limit executions actually doesn't cover up. But this is a relatively small abuse in terms of numbers. Another broad area of German abuses here is as the Allied bombing campaign ramps up, both the British and the Americans in 1943, the Germans, particularly led by Himmler, and I believe also Goering, begin to strongly encourage German civilians to basically lynch downed Allied aircrew. And here the idea is, from their point of view, what they want to do is try and cover up their intent. They don't want to just go out and massacre them because they don't want it to appear like it's a state act, because then the U.S. and the British might retaliate against Germans held prisoner. They encourage lynching as a way to say, oh, well, we couldn't do it. The civilians were so mad about the brutality of the air campaign, they spontaneously killed these people. And so again, it's an attempt to cover up abuses in an odd sort of way in which you want to try and break the law, but you don't want to make it so obvious in those cases that the other side will know it and respond. Oops. All right, issues on the battlefield. I'm going to speed up here a little bit. So there are a number of different issues that complicate. Now, this is generally a situation where both sides more or less want to follow the rules, and there's lots of notable exceptions. So one area that produces problems are elite troops. That is, so here's actually a picture of an SS man actually successfully surrendering. He's one of the few lucky ones. Both the SS on the German side and the airborne troops on the US side both had the reputation for not taking prisoner, and as a consequence were rarely taken prisoner. And that was different. And that you could see in those settings that they had a sense of who they were fighting against and what their chances were against them and how they were likely to respond to it. That's an example about how the dynamics of expectations change behavior on the battlefield. There are also military practices here that influence the ability to surrender. So under German military doctrine at the time, soldiers were not authorized to surrender until they had fired off all their ammunition. The consequence of this was that so U.S. troops approached like a bunker. They work their way around it. They're being shot at. People in the bunker trying to kill them. They get up, close enough to actually be able to attack the bunker. All of a sudden, the guys in the bunker want to surrender because now they finally shot off all their ammunition. This presents a problem. The U.S. soldiers, we'll never know how many cases are, shall we say, they're not so inclined to take surrender at that point. Would have been much more willing if they had done before. There are also military practices around there, such as the fact that, for example, German medics commonly carried sidearms so they could carry out mercy kills. U.S. medics, at least in Europe, were very, very rarely armed because that was a violation of their medical protection. Finally, the last issue on the battlefield I want to bring up here is the efforts that the United States makes to encourage German soldiers to surrender. And they're very conscious that this is part of their strategy, particularly when you get to the end of the war. So they engage in extensive leafleting of the German military and German civilians as a way to try and encourage surrender. And that's because the U.S. deliberately sees it as part of their policy that it saves American lives to get them to surrender, so we want to take steps to encourage that. And in general, what this means is this is the happy case. This is one in which treatment, although it had a lot of notable failings at different times, is generally better than that during World War I, when you look at states in World War I that attempted to comply, or that tried to comply. Now, this is the happy case where both sides seem to see it as in their interest to follow the rules in this case. Now we get to the first unhappy case, which is the Eastern Front. And here, the record between Germany and the Soviet Union. Okay, this is a case where the rules break down, both on the battlefield and outside the battlefield. If we want estimates of the death rates, and this gives you an idea about how different the problem is. Of the Germans who were taken prisoner by the Soviets, somewhere between 1/6 and 1/3 die in captivity. Of those taken prisoner by the Germans, that is Soviet soldiers taken prisoner, roughly 3 out of 5 die. This is millions of deaths. This is like about 3.5 million out of close to 6 million taken prisoner. What causes this? First and foremost are abysmal camp conditions. So what we have here is this is a picture of one of the POW enclosures that the Nazis created in the summer and fall of 1941. And throughout the campaign, through Operation Barbarossa, they take numerous large encirclements where they take hundreds of thousands of prisoners. When they take those people prisoner, they basically move, not in all cases, but in most cases, they put them in large barbed wire enclosures that lack appropriate shelter, food, sanitation, or any kind of cover. And as a result, the death rates are truly astounding throughout all cases. What changes this behavior, actually, is the failure of Operation Barbarossa in the front of Moscow, when the Nazis begin to realize they're not in a short war, they're in a long war. And they come up with sort of a chilling conclusion, which is, why are we allowing these people to starve to death when we could work them to death? And as a result, they then begin to provide better conditions for Soviets held prisoner. But that's so that they can use them effectively as slave labor in places like mines and other areas, and as a result. And so the death rates remain high. Now out of this, what's sort of the rationale behind this? Of the two different parties around, the Soviet Union signed but did not ratify the 1929 Geneva Convention. Germany did. Hitler used that as an excuse. So shortly after Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet government contacts, through the government of Sweden, the Nazi government, and says, okay, if you'll follow the rules, we'll follow the rules. And the Nazis basically say, no, we're not playing that game. We're not going to do that for you. And of course, what's interesting about this, in contrast to a treaty, is this is entirely a private action, right? If you go through private diplomatic channels, that's not easily observable. It wouldn't change any sort of anticipations of other actors in a way that a treaty ratification would. But it's important to understand that's used as an excuse, because from the moment that the Nazi forces crossed into Soviet territory on June 22nd, 1941, they begin killing Soviet soldiers who attempt to surrender. Now, part of that is the infamous Commissar order, where they're ordered to kill political officers embedded in Soviet units when they find them. But it's also very clear from the beginning of the war, from internal military reports in those divisions, that they're actually killing people really who they're not supposed to be killing from the very, very beginning of the war. Okay, what about what happens on the battlefield? Well, in part, once Soviet soldiers began to become aware that when people surrender, they never come back, and they learn something about the treatment of that, is after 1941, relatively few Soviet soldiers are actually taken prisoner. Now, there are some notable encirclements and the like, but there are not so many. Part of the reason for this is the battlefield then degrades into exceptional levels of brutality and also summary executions, both of enemy soldiers trying to surrender and in some cases by officers of their own soldiers trying to surrender. And so by all accounts, the battlefields on the Eastern Front become extraordinarily brutal, in which many parties understand that there is, there's no point in even trying to surrender because you're better off taking your risks trying to fight your way out. Out of this, then, it's also important to understand that both sides adopted policies that were designed to discourage their own soldiers from surrendering. That is, that in the Soviet Union, they threatened, for example, families if they found out that the soldiers surrendered. Stalin's son was taken prisoner by the Nazis, and the Nazis offered to exchange him. Stalin was not interested. In fact, Stalin's son ended up being killed by the Germans in a POW camp when he basically threw himself on a fence. So it was basically effectively suicide out of it. Similarly, the Nazis also had policies. There are variations on the estimates of how many German soldiers on the Eastern Front were summarily executed by their own officers. I've seen estimates that range from 10 to 30,000. So this is not an isolated policy. This is something that's happening pretty regularly as the war goes on. Okay, our last case here is the war in the Pacific. And this is a really interesting case where one side would like to follow the rules and the other side doesn't, and how that comes out of it. So this is one in which the abuse is on the Japanese side, and that one of the consequences that's going to have is, although the United States and its Commonwealth allies generally want to try and follow the rules, Japanese conduct on the battlefield is going to lead to a breakdown between the two sides. So again, to look at the death rates here, of U.S. and Commonwealth soldiers held prisoner by the Japanese, over 1/4 died during their time of captivity. And of course, the simplest explanation of that is this picture at the top, which is a group of Allied POWs upon liberation, and you can see a lot of ribs there. And that's because, in general, the diet was not. Here's where the diet provision of the 1929 Geneva Convention kicks in. Because the Japanese, at that point, more or less followed the rules, which is they fed them as well they fed Japanese soldiers. But that diet was not substantial to sustain over the long haul the health of both U.S. and Australian prisoners who were held in those settings. There are big differences in camp conditions. So U.S. and Commonwealth camps are generally pretty much exemplary on most grounds. That's not true about Japanese camps. But there's an important difference between Japanese conduct here and Nazi conduct, which is Nazi conduct seemed to be much more clearly, particularly on the Eastern Front, centrally controlled. That's not so true about Japanese conduct. It's much more a result of a set of attitudes inculcated through Japanese military training, in which that those who surrender are, if they're lucky, to be held only in contempt, as opposed to absolutely despised. And so there is variation in camp treatment across here, from merely bad to horrific abuse. And I won't go into, when you do this kind of project, you read a lot of gruesome stories. I won't give you any gruesome stories. And so there's a lot that comes out of that. But here the difference is it's variations in what camps do. Some are led by officers who engage in very, very brutal behavior, others in merely sort of standard different forms of abuse. So unlike the Nazis, it doesn't appear to be as centrally directed, but it's driven by a general military attitude of rejection of POWs. Now out of this, Japan neither signed nor ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention. In part, the reason for this is a deliberate calculation by the Japanese military during the interwar period, anticipating the possibility they will find themselves at war with Western powers, whether it be the United States or Britain. They think that one military advantage they can have is to produce a much harder fighting force. That is, to have soldiers who are more dedicated to fight. And the Japanese military does astonishing acts of self-privation throughout the war. I'll come back and talk about that picture on the bottom in a second. What this means is that very few Japanese are taken prisoner during the war. Until you get to Okinawa, I think the total is only about 10,000 or so. And there's lots of stories I can tell you around this. The primary thing that contributes to this is, first of all, Japanese military training. And then secondly, once they're in units, social control to prevent individual soldiers from surrender. And so the training aspect of it is on several different dimensions. One of the most important ones is that sort of the simplest way to summarize this is they train their soldiers that if you surrender, it is worse than if you die. It will be as if you no longer exist in the eyes of Japan. So that if you die, well, at least your memory lives on within your family and you're honored. If you surrender, we don't want to know who you are. You're gone. And in fact, at one point, this has very, very interesting consequences I want to talk about in this last point here. But so the Japanese are trained to do that, also trained to have nothing but contempt for those who do surrender. Because these are despicable people in the view that's promoted there. Now, that's also backed up by social control. That is to create a situation that makes it extremely difficult for those who want to surrender to do so. And there's varieties of different forms of social control to do this. What this leads to are, and again, we don't know how common this was, but certainly it was widely believed by U.S. soldiers and Marines in the war in the Pacific, is that the Japanese would widely engage in perfidy. That is a classic example of someone who's critically wounded. You know, when the medic comes over to them, they pull out the grenade, and explode it, killing both themselves and the medic. Now, how often that happens, or other examples of you want to surrender, bring the Americans in the open, kill them all. Now, how often that happened, we don't know. We do know that U.S. soldiers thought it was very, very common, and they learned about it very, very quickly. There also, of course, are atrocities taken out on the corpses of those who've been executed after surrendering as well. What this leads to is a situation where most U.S. soldiers are unwilling to take prisoners. They're not interested in taking Japanese prisoners. Part of this is purely defensive. When you come on a battlefield with a variety of Japanese bodies on it, shoot all of them. Don't take a chance. And of course what that means is one set of people you could take prisoner are those who are critically wounded and incapacitated, but if you kill them, you can't. And in fact, U.S. soldiers then engaged in a variety of different forms of atrocious conduct during the war in the Pacific as a consequence out of that. What this means is U.S. soldiers are typically unwilling to take Japanese prisoners. I'll give you an example. Before Okinawa, about the roughly 10,000 Japanese taken prisoner, about half of them are people who have been rescued from the sea. And that is in a situation where they can't harm their rescuers, and in which it's clear they don't pose any danger to the people fishing them out of the sea. And so a substantial number of those who are actually taken prisoner are those who are in a position where they cannot threaten the U.S. Those people become very important. Because here's now the unexpected consequence of not training your soldiers in their rights and responsibilities. Okay, the Japanese training around surrender tells them nothing about their rights under the 1929 Geneva Convention. They don't understand that they have no right to talk, that they can say, we don't want to talk to you and provide intelligence. Furthermore, when they get back into camps, they find out that the U.S. and the Commonwealth powers actually treat them better than their own military did. As a result, a number of Japanese prisoners taken begin to identify much more closely with their captors than they do with their original country. After all, they no longer exist in the eyes of Japan. Where is your life now? It's not with Japan now, it's with your captors. What this means, in fact, okay, I'll tell this little story. So at one point, the POW camp in Hawaii, when they do the roll call, 1% of the Japanese prisoners give the same name, which is that of the biggest Japanese film star of the time. So it's like going to a U.S. POW camp and everybody says John Wayne. Now, it's only 1%, but essentially, I don't want to give my name. I don't want to be identified as somebody who was taken prisoner. All right, so the intelligence benefit out of this is particularly the people they pull out of the sea. They have technical knowledge, for example, of planes that they're pilots, or alternatively ships. And once they discover the U.S. treats them better, they're quite happy to provide intelligence. And often quite valuable technical intelligence. So that's the advantage of it, is that one thing that all armies want to get out of prisoners is intelligence. One form of intelligence that's valuable because it has persistent value are things like ideas about the performance of weapons, the layouts of ships, and other things. The Japanese some Japanese prisoners provide that freely and in detail. both the United States and Australia, as a consequence of this, begin to create a system where they will bring those prisoners back to the homeland with a whole system to maximize the intelligence they gather. And that's because they're very, very valuable. And so they set up an entire system to do that, to treat those prisoners well, to maximize the intelligence out of them. Now, this also has a knock-on effect. As they discover the Japanese POWs are a valuable intelligence source, they want the soldiers at the front to take more prisoners. So they start sending out orders to take more prisoners. Those orders don't work. Orders alone don't work. The only thing that actually increases the take in Japanese soldiers taken prisoner is when they start rewarding those who bring in a Japanese prisoner with leave time. So they have to actually put material benefits on there to give U.S. soldiers say, okay, I'll take the risk of taking somebody prisoner, or alternatively, I won't act on my desire to basically kill every Japanese that I see. Okay. So as I've gone a little bit long, let me wind up with sort of the conclusion. The key thing out of this is looking at the prisoner of war issue. Law actually makes a difference. International humanitarian law, when it worked, has saved lives. I mean, if you ask me to guess, I would say that the 1929 Geneva Convention probably saved tens of thousands of lives in World War II, at least. That's a consequential development. Having said that, actually making law work is difficult because there's essentially two different problems that manifest here with prisoners of war. One are differences in views across the warring parties about what POWs are about and how they should be treated. A second issue around this are complications on the battlefield, which is how can you actually create a battlefield where it's possible for people to surrender. In both of these, particularly on the battlefield side, one of the things that's key is military training. That is, what are your rights and responsibilities, backed up by things, and then with military discipline behind that to reinforce that over time. And those things are really key, which is one reason why the Japanese case is so much different. And finally, out of these, now broadening the picture back out to think about across the 8 different issues, of those 8, the POWs is actually one of the more difficult issues facing international humanitarian law, which is why it has one of the sort of lesser records among the different issues there. Okay, I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your talk. I found it very illuminating. Just one correction. Japan did sign the 1929 Geneva Convention. It did not ratify.
Okay, I'll have to go back and look that up.
Yeah, I get what the operation is.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
Anyway, I'm wondering if you take into account racial attitudes and their impact on surrendering or not. It seems to me the 2 examples, and this is kind of the 2 examples where a lot of prisoners died at the Eastern Front and the Pacific, both of those were situations where there was racial animosity. In the case of Hitler, it was imposed from the top with his sort of worldview, his Weltanschauung. In the Pacific, John Dower would point out that both sides had very racially tinged attitudes towards the other. So how do you account for that in your research?
okay, that is part of the story. This is part of the attitudes there. But the question is, when can law chip also? If you have parties who want to do that, this kind of law is not going to prevent that in any sense. So, but let me talk a little bit more about both those cases. Let me start with the Pacific. Yeah, so obviously I've read Dower's book. I have a section on it. I'll make an observation. Most of the racist indoctrination that Dower recounts at length and detail, very effectively, actually comes somewhat later in the war. It comes like 43, 44. If we look at those U.S. servicemen who were in the field early on, so like in the Philippines in 42, they didn't have that indoctrination. And they're a very interesting case because they come in from the accounts I've read of it, they come in with the anticipation, well, we're supposed to follow the rules, so the Japanese will follow the rules, right? So they start out with that. It takes very little time for them to be disabused of that because of the abuse that happens in the battlefield, where, for example, they find the mutilated remains of someone who tried to surrender, for example. And as a result, their attitudes deteriorate very, very quickly over a matter of like weeks or so. And these are people who then go back to the same sort of behavior. The same is true when we look at periods like Guadalcanal, the first sort of extended periods of it, is what changes U.S. attitudes. These are not soldiers who receive, they may have some of the underlying racist attitudes towards the Japanese that were common in the U.S. at that time. But they didn't have the same indoctrination that became much more common later in the war. But even they relatively quickly came to a position of essentially protective hostility, is the way I would put it. So I agree that part of the story here in the Pacific is that sense of racism behind it. But also, that's being reinforced by what's happening on the battlefield. So it's not just enough of them saying, these people are subhuman and despicable, they're acting despicable. And so the two are reinforcing one another. Now let me turn to Europe, because the Nazis are really interesting question. And I agree that part of the story here are underlying racist attitudes, or actually, I don't know if you call them anti-ethnic attitudes, but the sort of the attitudes inculcated by the Nazis. That's part of the reason why there's execution of prisoners from the beginning. And part of that is promulgated by the Nazi hierarchy going all the way up to Hitler from the beginning. But there's interesting aspects and variation in what the Nazis do. And I'll give you one of the populations who they have the same attitude to, that they treat very differently in two different situations, which are Poles. So in 1939, when they overrun Poland, they take a substantial number of Polish soldiers prisoner. Those people are treated pretty bad. They're treated generally worse than the French were, but not as bad as the Soviets. So in general, if they had Poles like that, that's how they would have preferred to treat them. A substantial number of Poles flee across the border into Romania, work their way west, in which point they get reinconstituted into Polish forces, as Polish divisions, that get incorporated as part of the British Army. So they're not Poles in British units. They're Polish units. They fly Polish flags. And then when they begin to fight, both in Italy and France, against the Germans, when they're taken prisoner, the Nazis are very careful to put them in the same camps with the British, not in the camps with the other Poles they took. And again, the logic there is, now again, it's not changing their attitudes towards Poles generally, but the law at the margin, now it's not going to produce good behavior all the time, but at the margin it's shaping them to a position where they say, we have to treat these people like the British because they're in some sense they're part of the British Army, and we don't want to give the British an excuse to do things back against us.
Assuming you have the capacity to keep prisoners, isn't it militarily irrational to treat prisoners badly? So you don't need the law. All you need is rationality. When they want to win the war, and you want to create casualties, one form of casualty, of course, is taking prisoners. So if you get the reputation of being nice to them, they'll surrender much faster.
What an American attitude. No, see, this is what's striking about a project like this. Is I agree, that's the U.S. attitude. You know, in fact, one of the things in here is when the British reject that, when the Americans go to the British and say, no, we don't want to do a prisoner exchange now, they almost have a calculation that says, if we release this many Germans, we expect this many more Americans will die. And that's why they resist. But that's a very, very American attitude. You know, if you go to countries like Japan and you read about the interwar experience, the interwar training, it is very explicitly, our soldiers aren't going to surrender. Why would we want to take prisoners? They're a burden.
Right, they also lost the war.
True. Well, it's a different question about whether or not it's a good strategy or bad.
My issue is not letting people do what you say, but basically it's irrational.
But the Soviets did win, right?
What?
The Soviets did win, and they're basically sending German soldiers to basically gulag conditions, where they're used as labor. It's certainly not designed to encourage
The
surrender.
cost of the war are going to be much higher because the Germans are unwilling to surrender. If you want the Germans to surrender, if you're nice to them, they would surrender. They would still win the war, but they'd win at a lower cost.
Well, I would agree with you, John. I would agree with you, John, but Comrade Stalin did not.
Yeah, I understand that people are not
Well, I'm
rational.
just saying, you see, others can see that
And if you consider revenge extremely important, then of course, if that's what you're fighting for, revenge, that's
and certainly that's part of the motivation of what happens on the ballot. And that's part of that deterioration, both in expectations, is the parties begin to say.
But if your only goal is to win the war, not to exact revenge or whatever, that you seem to be wanting.
Well, all right, let me give you some of the other logic of those who want a brutal battlefield, which is also motivating our soldiers. So part of that story of both the Nazis and the Soviets is they want to make sure their own soldiers fight and fight out, and that they're positively worried about it. And you can see why Stalin would be worried about that at different times. And so, now I'm not saying that this is the right strategy. I'm saying this is what they believed in. And this is how they viewed the issue and what they thought was the right policy. Now, whether or not that was the right policy, it doesn't matter. The question in law is what happens, you know, when you have parties who have very, very different views of these things. How can you reconcile them? Yeah.
So, I want to clear up a little confusion, it's probably confusion on my part. When you observe a difference between signatories and non-signatories, in general, you can explain that either by screening, as you pointed out, the non-signatories are the ones who don't want to make the investment necessary, or by constraining, that signing the actual piece of paper does change their behavior. And those two mechanisms are sort of in tension with one another when you're trying to explain the variation that you observe between behavior of signatories and behavior of non-signatories. So at the beginning of your talk, I thought you were telling a screening story. And you said, screening really matters. The countries that don't sign are the ones that don't want to comply. By the end, I had sort of come around to thinking that you were telling a constraining story. In particular, no, that's not the case. Okay. Can you clarify? Yeah.
Let me go back and do this.
Yeah.
I'll do this by looking at the case. Okay. So here we have a case where, all right, here's one. Now, I'd say ratification, not signing. Because parties sign and they're not ratified.
Sorry.
We should know that in the U.S. So one is here's a case where both sides ratify. So both said, we think we might want to follow through on this. And that makes it easier for both sides to create and sustain the expectations that they'll actually do it. So that's the key. Is that sort of the creation of the, oh, you want to do this too, I want to do this too, we know one another wants to do this. Still may not be easy in practice, but our expectations around doing that are around that. Okay, case two is one side says, we don't want to do this. And the other side says, well, we really don't want to do it either, even though we ratified this, we're going to use this as an excuse. And so here's a party where again, the screening matters. Is that here it's a case where, because one side didn't sort of publicly said we didn't want to do it, the other side said, oh great, here's an excuse for us to say we're not going to do that either. And so now that creates a set of expectations and has strategic dynamics down in the battlefield that produce a much more brutal battlefield. The last one that looks like that, of course, is another one where one of the parties doesn't ratify. And here's the one where the other side ratifies and actually wants to follow through and tries to its extent. But the dynamics behind one of the parties that isn't, has screened itself out, say, we're not following those rules, we're not going to fight that kind of war. And as a result, that then triggers battlefield dynamics that leads a lot of the other side to engage in behavior that would clearly be clearly are at the individual level violations of the treaty. So here, I didn't clarify this term, but the screening matters. So if I go all the way into my formal model about this, the screening basically matters because the parties that screen themselves out are like the Japans here, who want a really brutal battlefield. And it's their attempt to try and induce that and produce that on the battlefield. Of those who ratify and pass through the screening, some of them may end up violating when you actually get there. And that's because they're going to figure out, for this particular case, they think it's in their strategic advantage to do this. In general, they sign on because it doesn't commit them to anything, in the sense of it doesn't tie their hands and force them to do it in the future. But it does say that if I put myself in a situation where I'm with somebody else who more or less wants to follow the rules, I'll more or less follow them. If it's with somebody else, then I'm free, hey, I'm free to ignore it. I'm going to go Marcus and then Alex.
Okay, so I had a quick question about whether the logic of one side clearly winning or not plays into dynamics in a way that might supersede some of this logic commitment. So, for example, if it's not clear which side is going to win or that it's going to happen anytime soon, there might be incentive for both sides to be kind of nice, because later on you're not sure if you're going to want to have a reputation for everybody when they win, or vice versa. On the other hand, if you're clearly winning, there might be an incentive to brutality, in the sense of, you're not just looking to capture prisoners, which you're not going to get, but you're going to encourage desertion. My grandpa Bluebeck runs away from the Russians, but there's a free rider problem, to find Americans to surrender to. Right, so there's, with the two things going on, is it entirely separable, particularly in the late stages of the war?
I can talk a little bit about what happens in the different fronts, sort of when you get near the end of the war. And there are some interesting sort of end of the war dynamics, but they're much more around trying to encourage surrendering on the part of the victorious side to try and get the war over quickly. There are efforts, like if you think about the Nazis, more efforts to try and buck up troops in different ways. Those have more success on the Eastern Front than they do on the Western Front for obvious reasons, but also that this is one where you can think about the consequence of what happens when the military discipline system starts to really break down. When you get to 1945, the Nazis are basically conscripting 12-year-olds and 16-year-olds and sending them out with no real preparation to fight. And it's hardly surprising that they have little or no control over those people. To the extent there's control, it's that they're thrown into a combat situation where literally it's kill or be killed. And that's the only way they can make that work. So there are some really interesting, sort of long war dynamics around that are sort of interesting. I didn't put a lot of emphasis in that. I mean, there are some also interesting ones in the early war period, like the negotiations between the British and the Germans, like in 1941 to 1943. Those are very asymmetric, though, because the Germans have a lot of British prisoners. The British don't have very many German prisoners. And so the Germans aren't really interested in deals, because it's hard to write deals that are really favorable, that they would see as favorable. And the burden of actually keeping the prisoners is not so bad. I don't think they're worried so much about reputation after the war. It's much more about the strategic calculation there. Okay, Alex.
I'm wondering about the role of, it kind of goes back to Sean's question about rationality. It seems to me that when your story sort of unfolds, a lot of the key causal work and the breakdown of these norms is really driven by emotions on the battlefield. The soldiers are getting pissed off, they're really revenge or whatever it is. And so emotions are what set these spirals and emotions and so on. And I'm wondering how you think about the role of emotions, given that you're a rational choice guy. So where do emotions, are they sort of at the margin and they explain some unexplained variance, or are they more central to the whole dynamic, or how do you see the relationship between these and then emotion?
Do you want me to answer that as a general question? Because I have a little bit of understanding from some of my colleagues who work like in American politics on emotion, how emotional people's work. But that's the broad answer. I can give you a specific answer for this
Let's
problem.
go with specific answer.
Okay, well, the specific answer is, obviously I'm not going to talk about emotions in here. But if I was to go through, if I go back to here, and so for those of you who don't know, I do game theory stuff. So this is three separate game theory models that are linked together. In this one of the key things that matters is that the other side has a wide range of types. And you're matched up against somebody, you don't know what type it is. It could be one of the types that's really honest and decent, and will almost really follow the rules even when they shouldn't. And you might run into one of those types who doesn't matter what the rules are, they're going to do the worst to you no matter what. And of course the trick is where does the line get split between those who act bad and those who won't? And so in that sense, what I think about it is like variation in types across them. So that here, that's why it's a strategic expectations problem. Is I'm thinking about, okay, you signal you want to surrender to me. Are you trying to lure me out, or are you actually willing to surrender? And those expectations matter a lot in making that.
That makes it probably a rational story.
Yeah, but see, if I think about the emotion story, from your point of view as the person surrendering, when I come out with my rifle, it may be, if I'm one of those really bad types, I'm the one who's just seen my three best buddies killed and it's time for payback. Because there's no doubt when you read these stories, that's a lot of the story of what happens in the battlefield. And I agree, I think emotion is part of it. But I'm really kind of interested at the larger level, how can you create, sort of get matches between action and expectation, given the fact that there may be types who just are either hotheads, or have bad days, or in some sense have a lot of humanity. And it's difficult to think about at a broader level how that works. But I agree.
As emotional stuff is coming up from the bottom, and that's sort of driving the eventual macro level kind of outcomes.
At some level, yes, but the question is how widespread does that emotion get, and how is it controlled? So I can give you, again, apocryphal stories of somebody, they take German prisoner, guy just wants to kill him because he heard his brother die. And the officer literally pulls the pistol out and says, you're not taking him back to the collection point, Joe here is instead. And makes it very clear that if the guy kills a prisoner, he'll kill him. And so that's where the question about, I agree emotion is part of this, because it's hard to imagine, soldiers in combat where emotion is not a huge part of what's out there. But at the same time, it's a question of, in the fact that you get variation in behavior here, when is it that these systems are more likely to control some of these pressures? When do they actually encourage the bad behavior and produce things that way? Okay, I go. Oh, go ahead.
It seems to me this is the second time I've seen this slide, and both times it occurs to me that there are actually lines that are missing here, which is the state A to state B soldiers and the state B to state A soldiers? Because, and I think that one of the really important relationships and concerns is the question of how the other state is going to be treating your soldiers in those camps as well. Is that influencing the decision, the behavior of state to the prisoners that they are changing? How does that actually get quantified?
Okay, I'd say here's how I think about it. So this is a model. So it's a picture of where I do my fancy math in this, and I can talk about each of these parts separately. Here's how this would think about it. Because I agree that is part of it. So if I tell the story about the U.S. trying to encourage German soldiers to surrender, not all of that operates through this path. Some of it operates through leafleting and life, which is like the sort of path you're suggesting directly here. But the way I'm commonly thinking about it is that, so if I'm the U.S. and I want to communicate to German soldiers, the primary paths through it are sort of like indirectly across here. And there is some evidence of that, of like communication between high-level Nazi officers and high-level U.S. officers, which are like that level. But it's more on trying to produce something down here. But I agree there are some cases like that. I just don't think they're that general in sort of across all these cases.
I mean, if we're looking at treatment of the soldiers as opposed to encouraging them to, the other side soldiers to surrender, isn't that line, that line between the other states' treatment of our soldiers and according to one and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, I can think about it. I'm trying to think about what would it look like if I wrote a model like that.
Certainly, modeling is not my thing.
Yeah, no, well, but you could imagine it's something like a story where we're trying to communicate. We're trying to tell you, no, you don't understand, we will treat you well. You'll get fed. You know, it is, but see, that's, my understanding of that is that the leafleting and the like, sort of the direct state appeals, in some sense are much less effective than sort of what these people figure out on their own through rumor and the like.
What I'm more interested in is state B convincing state A to treat state B soldiers well by treating state A soldiers well.
Yeah, there are some examples like that. There are attempts to try and say we want behavior that's like this. But again, that sort of moderate. I would say, from my person, it's moderating those channels. But there are examples like that. Okay, I got it. Yes, it's you.
All right. So I'm interested in potentially a major missing variable we're all taking our swings at the missing variables being sort of the role of information here and mechanisms of information spread. Because it seems like if you're worried about how you're going to play the game, and let's say you're going to treat, you say there's a strategic advantage to abusing or killing POWs, would you say we're not going to do that, we're going to treat them well because we're worried that the other side's going to do that, right? Germany seems to be following the rules on that logic. So it's like, well, we don't want them to slaughter our guys or whatever. There has to be some mechanism by which the other side is going to find them out, right? What you're doing in your own camps, in your own territory, how you're treating these guys has to spread ultimately to the other side of the battlefield. And moreover, they're trying to get away with the sneaky ways of doing that, and they're still being outed in many cases. So how is information being spread, and are there systematic ways in which the independence or dependence of the media or military-controlled information matters here?
Okay. All right, I'll tell you what actually happens in the cases, and then I'll tell you why I ignore this problem, which is a limitation of the tools I use. Okay, so the reality is this happens in a lot of different ways. Where camps are sort of well done, there are communications to go back and forth between prisoners and the whole population. So if I think about those British prisoners in 1941 held by Germany, there's communication back and forth because they can write letters and the like. And so there is some about that. So in some of these cases, the home country can learn about these things. That's how you get those like POW families back in Britain pressing the British government about things, is they found out about things about the conditions under which, or the personal health of their relatives who are now in prison. So in some cases it works like that. In other cases where the parties are really bad, it only leaks out over time. So if I think about like Japanese cases, when the Japanese take people prisoner very shortly after Pearl Harbor, like the first 2 months after Pearl Harbor, there's a bunch of atrocities there. The Japanese say, well, we'll follow the rules more or less as we see appropriate. They make a public declaration. And of course, they have no intention of doing any, or they have no intention of taking any action that might turn that into a reality. And the reality is, in fact, the prisons are pretty brutal. And it's really hard for information to get out of there because it takes a long time, because if you're, like, for example, Canadian, taken prisoner in Hong Kong, you escape from a POW camp, you're going to get caught because you're going to stick out like a sore thumb in South China at that time. It's going to be easy to identify. So it takes about a year or more before the Canadian and U.S. governments begin to understand sort of what the conditions are like in POW settings.
Is that in some way related to the fact that you have these centralized authoritarian governments that don't have independent legal systems? And
Yes, that's part of it. But on top of it, then the U.S. and Canadian governments try and control that information because they don't want to inflame their own populations. They're already sufficient.
they've reached a maximum.
Yeah, they got it to 10, they don't need to go to 11, right? Okay, so in this, it also varies, but also a lot of it is rumor. I mean, it's stunning when you read, when you read the accounts and like synthetic accounts out of these, how often rumor plays a role in sort of the positions and that are expressed and the judgments about what's going on and what's likely to happen. And those often change very, very quickly with local conditions too. They can change from like, well, this division, last time we saw them 3 weeks ago, killed a bunch of our guys. We're not taking any of that person. So it's also very, very situational. In some of the stories, it's very, very situational. Okay, now the honest answer about my modeling techniques. This is game theory. Game theory is an equilibrium theory. It does not talk about like the dynamics of the communication there, because the nature of equilibrium is that the action and the expectations are matched to each other. Now, in reality, what you have is like in the case of those soldiers who fought in the defense of the Philippines in 1942, they come in with one set of expectations that get changed over a period of several weeks. So saying, yeah, we think the Japanese will follow the rules. Everybody follows the rules, right? Oh, these guys are not following the rules. And yes, there is a current period of communication on that, but that's through like the spread of rumor and the like that plays a large role there. If you talk about going back to the home front, that too gets more complicated.
Yeah, so I'll let other people go, but it seems like a variable that changes over time. Like Vietnam, there's much more independent war reporting, so does that a variable that puts you in different process? But,
Yeah.
Actually, the Japanese treatment of POWs was spread by escaped prisoners who brought the stories of the death march members back to the Carlos headquarters. And it worked against the Japanese in the end. The American soldiers fought harder once they realized how brutal the Japanese were treating their prisoners.
But they also had experience on the battlefield that reinforced that. This is both.
So I was wondering how much state status matters for this story, and if you had a case where one party is not actually a state, like the insurgent group or the Vietnam case, whether that would just be parallel to the one-sided ratification, or if it would be a totally different story if one side doesn't have the ability to ratify.
I'll give you a book here. It's by one of my students, here in Joe. Compliant Rebels. Came out a year or so. It's a similar study to this about compliance by rebel groups in civil wars over like about the last 20, 25 years. I'll give you my impressionistic sort of overview, which is that it varies a lot. There are some rebel groups that actually are very interested in reciprocity and take a very strong stance of trying to follow humanitarian law to the extent they can and trying to create ideas of reciprocity with the state. That often is rejected by the state because they don't want to create a sense of legal equality between them. Because they don't, from their point of view, rebels are traitors. So that's difficult to do. And most of her book is really on what are the rebel groups doing that. Of course, there are also other rebel groups that deliberately adopt atrocity as part of their strategy. That is part of the strategy. So there's a lot of variation in behavior across that. And it is more difficult because there are like public declarations by groups that will say we'll do this. So there's a group in Geneva Call, that basically does both a combination of IHL training for rebel groups, but also allows them to sign public pledges that they follow through on. And they try and reach lots of different rebel groups. There are people who've done papers on this relatively recently. So the rebel situation is more complicated. One of the decisions I made in this project early on was I was only going to do interstate wars, because when I started collecting this data over 15 years ago, the Civil War stuff would have been really, really hard. Part of, I didn't talk at all about the data side of this project, but one reason why this is also historical is over the last 25 plus years, there's been a lot of interest in history about compliance with IHL, or about what happens in wartime around humanitarian law. And as a result, there's a lot of good sort of, historians have done the hard work of sorting through the rumors and the stories so that we can figure out what's actually true and what's actually not true. That's actually one of the problems of doing more contemporary cases, is there's a lot of charges and countercharges that would makes it harder to do something like this.
So I was curious if this gets based on this recent literature on coup-proofing, how governments will undermine their own military's effectiveness because they're more worried about losing power than defeat on the battlefield, basically. And I was curious, I don't know how much your book looked at cases like, say, Iran in the 80s, but like, does that have an impact on how states are able to follow IHR?
It's an interesting question. I suspect that's less of a problem, but now I'm just going to speculate. Because in the Iraq-Iran case, from the data set, it has pretty bad behavior on a lot of different dimensions, including prisoners of war. I don't know if coup-proofing in Iraq makes much of a difference around that. But some of that has to do with see, coup-proofing, as I understand it, is much more a story about the high leadership and choosing people for political loyalty over military competence. And that in some sense made me orthogonal to this. That is, I don't know if there's a correlation in any form between those. They move together in any way. So are more competent officers more likely to try and follow law? I don't know if that's necessarily the case at all. So that's sort of my quick speculation on it.
I have a very naive question about method. So it seems to me like what you very tactfully spared us the math. And what you've given us is, a kind of elegant analytic description of the strategic problems. And we've been arguing about details of the story. And I'm curious because I've understood everything. And so I'm wondering what I don't understand. Well, I know how to do kind of elegant analytic descriptions too. I wonder if you could talk a bit for those of us outside of your area about where you see the necessity and the contribution of the math. That is, when you go from this verbal modeling into formal modeling, what happens and where's that value added?
Okay. Let me talk sort of broadly about the book, because you're only seeing really one chapter of the book with sort of an overview of the big argument. And so this book has, I think of it as other little side parts, but there are three big parts. So one part is this math stuff. I do that because I find it really helpful for me in thinking through the problems and going through it. And I use it because it helps discipline my mind and clarify the argument for me. It also, for the technically trained reader I want to reach, puts it in a way that helps them really understand the true essence of the argument, because it strips it really down to its basics. So they can look at it. Now, I also understand when I do that, most of my readers can't read it. So if you actually look at the book, when you go to chapter 3, which is this, there's chapter 3 and there's chapter 3 prime. Chapter 3 is all words, and with like a verbal description model. All the math stuff is in chapter 3 prime, because I hope to reach international lawyers who, when they got to the last page of chapter 3, go, oh, I don't want to read that, and go right to chapter 4. So from my point of view, this is where I find this useful. And for people sort of in my immediate research community who understand this, we find it really, really valuable. Now, having said that, I'm also very, very conscious that, as I said, there's a reason why I split that chapter into two parts, because I understand a lot of the people I want to reach are, well, the best phrase for it, are going to be turned off by that. They're going to close the book and stop reading. And I don't want that. And so that's why I want to separate the two out, but by disciplining my intuition through this, now I think I can explain the story verbally and more carefully to somebody about where I think the causation lies. Now, then I get to the next big part of it, which is the statistics, which I didn't talk about at all. And it too has different problems. It has the advantage that now I can look at variation across issues and across a lot of different kinds of cases and like, and now I can paint a big picture, sort of the big picture of international humanitarian law. That chapter 2 is split into 2 parts. Because again, I want to reach international lawyers. They don't want to read a bunch of tables like political scientists. All the good stuff. Where's the T statistics? That the rest of the audience won't. So I want to split that off. And then this third part, there's also a companion chapter with shorter case stories of 4 other issues. But that's to say, well, the problem with the statistics is it is very, very aggregate. And it's very, very broad brush on patterns. The advantage of something like this is I can now dive deep into something and the same way that I think I've tried to do in this presentation, show you, here's how some of that argument's really working out in practice. Sort of, not just, oh, look, the coefficient goes like this, and as this variable goes up, that one, behavior gets worse. But I can also say, okay, let's go back and understand how this works at a much more detailed level, because it's essentially saying no one of these tools people like me have is perfect. And using more of them gives you more confidence in the answer you have at the end. I think it's the best description about why this is done the way it is. And then I assume you understand why I talk about this part of it.
Yes.
We have to keep Jim on schedule. I want to thank everyone for coming, especially thank Jim.